They told you it was just a dog, a loyal companion, a creature of habit and affection. But what if that's the smallest part of the truth? What if, thousands of years ago, the scribe god Thoth saw this very moment and spoke of a time when animals would awaken not as servants, but as guides sent to lead humanity back to what we had lost? Look around. The world is shifting in ways we can feel, but cannot always name. And quietly, almost unnoticed, our dogs are changing too. They sense storms before the clouds form, illness before symptoms appear, danger before it draws near. They watch us with eyes that seem to hold something older, deeper, and entirely deliberate. This is where our journey begins, on the edge of myth and memory, where the veil between the ordinary and the sacred thins. Stay with me, and together we'll uncover what Thoth may have known all along, and why your dog might just be part of the prophecy. We've been told the same story for generations. A dog is a pet, loyal, affectionate, maybe even protective, but still just an animal. It's a simple truth we rarely question, but buried deep within the ancient writings of Thoth, the legendary scribe of the Egyptian gods, is a very different truth. One that flips our familiar understanding upside down and asks us to see dogs not simply as companions, but as something far more extraordinary, guardians in disguise. Thoth's prophecies speak of a time when humanity would wander so far from its spiritual origins that we would forget who we truly are. We'd become disconnected from our intuition, our essence, and the unseen threads that tie us to the greater whole. In that time of deep forgetting, certain guides would appear not to lecture or dominate, but to quietly steer us back toward remembrance. Some of these guides would walk among us in human form. Others would choose to arrive clothed in fur. In Thoth's vision, dogs were never a product of chance domestication. They were bridges between the worlds, stationed at the invisible border between the physical and the spiritual. They were guardians of the threshold, placed exactly where the known meets the unknown. And perhaps the most striking part of his message is this: the bond you share with your dog didn't begin the day you met. It began long before either of you entered this lifetime. Thoth called it a soul contract, an agreement forged in some deeper realm, promising that when the time was right, your paths would cross. Think back to the first moment you met your dog. Was it planned, or did it happen in a way that felt strangely fated? Maybe you went to just look at a shelter and somehow couldn't leave without them. Maybe they found you on a rainy street. Maybe you locked eyes across a crowded rescue event and everything else faded. However it happened, that meeting was no accident. Modern science tries to explain away these connections. It points to evolutionary instinct, scent detection, or training. And yet, there are things science still struggles to measure. Stories abound of dogs who know their person is ill before any symptoms appear. Dogs who pace and whine hours before an earthquake. Dogs who plant themselves stubbornly between you and a stranger you've just met, as if they're reading a warning in the air. Skeptics call it coincidence or hyper-awareness, but those who've lived through it feel something different, an invisible knowing, as if the dog is tuned into a channel we've forgotten how to hear. Even in the lab, scientists admit there are limits to what they can explain. They can measure how a dog's presence lowers blood pressure. They can document how a steady gaze from your dog can release oxytocin in your brain. But they can't tell you why your dog somehow shows up in the exact room you're crying in, or why they refuse to move from your side on the one night you really needed someone there. That is where Thoth's prophecy becomes not just mystical poetry, but a lens for seeing the truth science hasn't yet named. If you've ever had your dog block your way, only to find out later there was danger ahead, if you felt their head rest on your lap during a moment of heartbreak, and somehow, without a word, your breathing slowed, then you've brushed against the edges of what Thoth described. These are not random acts. They are part of an ancient role, to stand as silent watchers, ready to nudge us back onto the path when we begin to drift too far. And maybe that's why so many people, even those who don't consider themselves spiritual, still describe a sense of peace when looking into a dog's eyes. It's not sentimentality, it's recognition. Something in us remembers that we've seen those eyes before, somewhere beyond time, in a place where we promised each other we would meet again. The world is noisy now, full of distractions that pull us further from ourselves. But in the middle of all that noise, your dog sits quietly, watching you, waiting for you to remember. They're not just keeping you company, they're keeping a promise. And if Thoth was right, that promise stretches far beyond this life. It is the promise of a guardian who chose to walk beside you, disguised in fur, until you can once again see who you truly are. There's a shift happening, subtle enough that you might miss it if you're not looking closely. It's in the way your dog freezes before you hear the knock at the door. It's in the way they suddenly refuse to walk down a certain path you've taken 100 times before. These moments feel small, even strange, but to those who have studied the old prophecies, they are signs. Signs that the guardians are awakening. Ancient texts from Egypt, Greece, and beyond spoke of a time when animals would begin to act differently, not in ways born of fear or habit, but in ways that hinted at a deeper awareness. Thoth's prophecy was clear. When humanity reached a point of great crisis, when chaos spread faster than truth, the animals we had long underestimated would remember who they were. They would step into their ancient roles again, not as servants, but as protectors and guides. Around the world, the stories are becoming harder to ignore. In Japan, dogs have been reported pacing and barking hours before earthquakes hit, guiding families to safety. In California, a shepherd refused to enter the house one night, only to have the hillside behind it give way in a sudden landslide. In Italy, a mixed-breed rescue stood watch outside the bedroom door for 3 nights straight before its owner suffered a heart attack, alerting the family in time to save him. Individually, these moments might be dismissed as coincidence, but seen together, they form a pattern that echoes what the ancients described. Dogs, and sometimes other animals, responding to dangers that haven't yet arrived, acting not on sight or sound, but on some invisible signal we can't quite measure. Scientists may point to seismic vibrations or scent detection, and there is truth in that. But these explanations only skim the surface. What the old prophecies suggest is that these behaviors are part of something far older, far more intentional. Thoth described this awakening as a remembering. For generations, these guardians have lived alongside us, their true purpose hidden beneath the daily routines of walks, meals, and naps. But as the world shifts, political divides widening, climates changing, diseases spreading, they begin to stir. It's as if something in the earth itself whispers to them, calling them to step forward. You might notice your dog's eyes tracking something you can't see, their ears pricking at sounds too low for human hearing. You might feel their body stiffen beside you before a stranger enters the room, their instincts reading an energy you don't yet recognize. These are not random acts. They are warnings, guidance, and sometimes quiet reassurances. They are the early ripples of a much larger wave. And it isn't just dogs. Across the globe, people speak of cats who will not leave a sickbed until their human recovers, of birds who alter their songs in the hours before a storm, of horses refusing to enter stables moments before fire breaks out. These stories, too many to ignore, carry the same rhythm, the same pulse, the natural world aligning itself in response to the state of the human world. The ancients saw this as a covenant between species, forged in a time when the boundaries between our worlds were thinner. The guardians would sleep until they were needed, and then, in the hour of greatest uncertainty, they would wake. That hour, Thoth warned, would not be gentle. It would come with tremors both literal and spiritual, forcing humanity to decide whether to return to the essence we had lost or to drift further into disconnection. If you've begun to see these signs, if your dog has acted in ways that left you rattled, curious, or strangely reassured, you may already be living inside this prophecy. It's not a story of fear, but of hope. Because if the guardians are awakening, it means we are not alone in this moment of reckoning. It means that in our most vulnerable hour, we are being quietly watched over, guided not just by wisdom from the past, but by living, breathing beings who have chosen to stand with us. The question is, will we notice in time? And when we do, will we listen? Sometimes, the way a dog comes into your life feels too perfect, too well-timed, to be explained away as coincidence. You weren't looking for a companion, and yet there they were at the shelter, on the side of the road, sitting quietly in a rescue center, as if they had been waiting for you all along. In the language of the mystics, these moments are not accidents. They are fulfillments of a promise made long before either of you arrived in this lifetime. Ancient spiritual traditions, including the Hermetic teachings linked to Thoth, speak of soul contracts, agreements made between beings at the level of spirit. These contracts are not legal or written. They are energetic bonds formed with purpose. In the case of dogs, the agreement might have been simple: when you lose your way, I will find you. When you forget who you are, I will remind you. And so they do. Some dogs arrive in moments of crisis, when you're grieving, when your health is failing, when your home feels emptier than you can bear. Others appear in times of transition, marking a chapter change in your life. You may think you chose them, but if you look closer, you'll see they were already on their way to you. The shelter worker who just happened to call that day. The neighbor who couldn't keep him and thought of you. These threads weave together like something scripted from a place far beyond chance. Within this contract, their roles are layered and dynamic. On the surface, they offer companionship and love, but underneath, they are healers absorbing the static and stress that collect in your body, recalibrating your nervous system with their steady presence. They are emotional anchors, sensing your shifts long before you speak them aloud. Some guard your physical safety, placing themselves between you and danger without hesitation. Others guard your spiritual boundaries, their behavior shifting when your environment or relationships begin to erode your peace. There are stories too many to dismiss of dogs lying across their owner's chest during a panic attack, their weight forcing breath to return. Of rescues who woke their humans in the middle of the night just before a fire broke out. Of quiet, gentle companions who sat beside a bed for months, holding space for someone's final journey from this life to the next. These are not random acts. They are the living fulfillment of the vows they made to you before either of you were born. The ancients believed that such connections carry echoes of past lives. Perhaps you and your dog have walked together before, in another form, another age. Maybe you were the protector once, and now they have taken that role for you. These exchanges of guardianship, lifetime after lifetime, create a bond that feels unshakable because it is. You can feel it in their eyes, the recognition that runs deeper than memory, the way they seem to know your patterns, your moods, your unspoken needs. And yet, the contract is not one-sided. You too have a role to fulfill. Just as they arrive to heal and guide you, you are called to protect, nurture, and honor them, to create a home where their spirit can thrive, to listen when they communicate in ways beyond words, to see them not as an accessory to your life but as a partner in your journey. When you honor this mutual agreement, something extraordinary happens. The connection deepens. Communication becomes intuitive. You start to sense each other's thoughts, anticipate each other's movements, share moments of pure understanding without a single sound. And in those moments, you feel the truth of what the old teachings tried to tell us, that love this deep is never accidental, and that sometimes our greatest teachers arrive on 4 legs, keeping a promise they made long before we knew their name. If your dog is with you now, it's worth asking yourself, what vow did we make to each other? What purpose brought us together in this life? The answer may change the way you see them. It may even change the way you see yourself. There are moments when the weight of the world feels unbearable, when your mind runs in dark circles and your chest tightens with an ache that words can't reach. In those moments, a dog will often do something quietly extraordinary. They'll find you. Without being called, without being told, they will place themselves beside you, as if they've been listening to a language no one else can hear. Ancient traditions might call this emotional alchemy, the art of transforming one state of being into another. In modern terms, it's the way a dog absorbs your emotional static, shifts your inner weather, and returns you to a place of balance. They don't do it by logic or reason. They do it through presence. Think about the last time you felt truly seen without having to explain yourself. That's what a dog offers every single day. Their body language slows to match your breath. They lean against you, grounding you in the physical world when your mind wants to drift away. Their eyes, steady, unhurried, become a mirror that reflects not the chaos you feel inside, but the calmer self you've forgotten is still there. There are countless stories of this transformation in action. A veteran, haunted by nightmares, wakes in the night to find his service dog lying across his chest, applying just enough weight to pull him back into the present. A teenager, spiraling toward despair, is interrupted by her golden retriever, nudging her hands until she can't help but smile through the tears. A widow, too grief-stricken to speak, sits in silence with her shepherd for hours, the dog's breathing syncing with hers until the sobs soften. These aren't tricks. They're acts of energetic healing, performed without ceremony, but with a precision that defies coincidence. Science has begun to catch up to what many of us have always felt. Studies show that interacting with a dog can lower cortisol, the stress hormone, and increase oxytocin, the bonding chemical that helps us feel safe and connected. But numbers and charts can only hint at the deeper truth. Dogs operate on frequencies that our bodies instinctively respond to. Their heartbeat, their warmth, their unshakable presence, these elements work together to pull us out of mental storms and back into the stillness of now. In the Hermetic sense, they act as living tuners, bringing our scattered energies back into harmony. If you're vibrating with anxiety, they absorb some of that tension and replace it with calm. If you're sunk in sadness, they lift your emotional frequency until you can breathe more easily. It's not magic in the fairy tale sense. It's a kind of spiritual physics, an exchange of energy between two beings who trust each other completely. What's remarkable is that they never seem drained by this work in the way humans might be. Perhaps it's because their connection to the natural world remains intact, allowing them to release what they take in. You might notice your dog shaking off after comforting you, or stretching in a patch of sunlight, or running freely after a heavy moment. These are ways they reset themselves, letting go of what isn't theirs to keep. And yet, their willingness to step into our storms never wavers. They don't ask for repayment. They don't keep score. Their reward is the quiet knowledge that you're okay again, or at least that you're not facing it alone. In that sense, they're not just healers, they're alchemists, turning pain into peace, fear into trust, isolation into connection. If you've ever had your dog curl against you when you felt most fragile, you've experienced this alchemy. It's an unspoken promise. I will hold this with you until it feels lighter, and somehow it does. In a world that often teaches us to push through, to harden ourselves against hurt, dogs remind us of a gentler way. They don't fix us because we're broken. They walk with us until we remember we were whole all along. That is the quiet miracle they perform, and it's one worth noticing, honoring, and perhaps learning to give back in our own human way. If you've ever walked into a room and found your dog already sitting at the door, tail wagging, as if they knew you were about to grab the leash, you've brushed against a mystery older than memory. It's a kind of communication that doesn't rely on commands or training, one that happens in the quiet space before words. Scientists will say it's about body language, subtle cues, or routines your dog has learned to recognize. And maybe, in part, that's true. But anyone who's lived with a dog long enough knows there are moments when the explanation feels too small for the thing that just happened. You only think about leaving for the park, and suddenly they're dancing in front of the door. You reach for your keys, not yet having said a word, and their head pops up from the other side of the house. Somehow they knew. Ancient Hermetic teachings attributed to Thoth himself describe a language of the soul that existed before speech. It was a way of sharing not just ideas, but states of being. In this language, what you feel, and what you intend radiates outward like a frequency, and those tuned to you can receive it without needing to translate. Dogs, it seems, have never forgotten how to speak it. There are stories, endless in their variety, that point to this hidden channel. A woman recovering from surgery swears her husky lay by the door every morning, exactly 3 minutes before the nurse arrived, no matter if she came at 9 or noon. A rancher in the middle of nowhere tells of his cattle dog waking him in the dead of night, moments before a wildfire swept toward the barn. A child with autism, who struggles with verbal communication, finds that her Labrador responds to her emotions before she herself knows how to express them. These aren't just anecdotes to the people who lived them. They are moments of connection that feel both utterly personal and strangely cosmic, like catching a whisper from an older, wiser world. And when you look into your dog's eyes after something like that, you get the uncanny sense they were listening to more than your voice. From a spiritual perspective, this is the bridge Thoth spoke of, the way certain beings can carry messages between realms. A dog doesn't need to understand your plan to know your intention. They don't have to hear you say you're afraid to feel the change in your heartbeat. They receive it in full, unfiltered, and respond with an honesty we often struggle to give each other. And perhaps that's why this bond feels so magical. It bypasses the noise, the misunderstandings, the endless explanations. It moves straight from essence to essence. In Hermetic thought, this is the purest form of communication. What happens when two beings meet in truth, without disguise? We can't force it. You can't sit your dog down and demand a telepathic moment, but you can make space for it. Slow your mind. Be present. Notice the subtle ways they mirror your breath, your mood, the tilt of your energy. The more you allow yourself to meet them there, the more fluent you become in that pre-verbal, soul-deep exchange. And when it happens, when you realize they've caught a thought you never spoke, it's both exhilarating and humbling, because in that instant, you understand that the connection isn't something you own or control. It's something ancient you've been allowed to share. A gift that arrives quietly, without ceremony, yet leaves you forever changed. Maybe that's the hidden meaning of this prophecy. Not just that dogs can read us, but that they invite us to remember a way of communicating we once knew, before words, before walls, before forgetting. And if we can remember it with them, perhaps we can learn to remember it with each other. There are moments when you notice your dog lying in a very particular spot, not for comfort, but for something deeper. Maybe it's the corner of a room you rarely use, or a patch of sunlight that falls just so. Sometimes, it's a place you've always felt uneasy in, though you could never explain why. And over time, you realize when they're there, the room feels different. Ancient cultures didn't see this as coincidence. In Egypt, in Mesopotamia, among the Celts and Native American tribes, dogs were often described as guardians not just of people, but of the energetic spaces people inhabited. They were thought to absorb what was harmful, to transmute the heaviness into something lighter, and to anchor the home in safety. It wasn't just metaphor, it was sacred animal symbolism at work. Modern science may frame this differently, speaking of emotional contagion, or the way animals can pick up on human stress hormones. But anyone who's lived through a hard time with a dog at their side knows it feels like more than that. They seem to pull tension out of the air. You sit beside them after an argument or a day of loss, and the space around you shifts quieter, warmer, more open. Some researchers studying geomagnetic fields have found that animals can sense variations in the Earth's natural resonance. The Schumann frequency, subtle changes in the electromagnetic heartbeat of the planet. Spiritual traditions take this further, suggesting that dogs not only sense these shifts, but act as buffers, keeping their human companions steady when the surrounding energy spikes or drops. Watch them closely, and you'll see patterns. They may bark into what seems like empty space, or refuse to enter certain rooms until something changes, an open window, a rearranged object, a simple sweep of fresh air. They might spend hours stationed at a doorway, not out of habit, but as if guarding the threshold itself. These behaviors, odd to the uninitiated, take on new meaning when you understand them as acts of energetic filtering. In this light, a dog becomes more than a pet. They're a living, breathing calibration tool. They find the places where energy pools and make them passable. They soak up what's jagged and redistribute something softer. And in doing so, they keep both your home and your mind in balance. This role isn't without cost to them. In some traditions, it's believed that dogs who serve as energetic protectors can tire or even fall ill from absorbing too much negativity. That's why ancient households often honored these animals with rituals, special food, protective charms, or simply a designated place of rest away from the heaviest spaces. The gratitude wasn't symbolic, it was recognition of a real exchange. If you've ever felt inexplicably better just from sitting beside your dog in a quiet room, you've experienced this gift firsthand, and it's worth returning the favor. Spend time outdoors together, where they can release whatever they've taken on. Let them bask in sunlight, splash in clean water, roll in the grass. Just as they clear your space, you can help clear theirs. Thoth's prophecy spoke of animals rising to help guide humanity through turbulent times. In that vision, dogs weren't just messengers, they were stabilizers, keepers of the energetic flow. When the world grows chaotic, they anchor us back to something steady, something pure. Perhaps this is why the bond feels so unshakable. In the quiet work of lying in the right spot, of guarding the unseen, they remind us of the harmony that still exists beneath the noise. They filter not just our spaces, but our hearts, returning us again and again to a place of light. In the golden sands of ancient Egypt, dogs were more than companions. They walked alongside pharaohs and priests, not merely as guards or hunters, but as sacred beings, incarnations of spirits who had chosen fur and flesh as their temporary home. The Egyptians saw them as kin to Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the threshold, whose task was to guide souls between worlds. To be in the presence of such a creature was to stand closer to the divine. But Egypt was not alone in this reverence. In Mesopotamia, dogs were linked to Gula, the goddess of healing, and often carved into temple walls as eternal protectors. Some were buried with their human companions, believed to continue their guardianship beyond death. Native American traditions spoke of spirit dogs, who crossed between the realm of men and the spirit world, bringing messages in dreams, warning of danger, or leading lost souls home. When you look at a dog through this lens, small behaviors take on extraordinary meaning. The way they fix their gaze on a stranger, not out of aggression, but as if they're scanning a deeper truth. The way they sometimes wake from sleep and stare into the distance, their ears twitching at sounds you cannot hear. Or those nights when they lie beside your bed, restless, as though standing watch over something you can't name. Many who have lived with such a dog describe uncanny experiences, dreams in which the dog appears as something more, a great wolf, a jackal, or a figure robed in light. In these dreams, they often communicate without words, their presence both familiar and otherworldly. Some awaken with the strange certainty that they've known this soul before, perhaps in another life, another body. In spiritual teachings, these are signs of a guardian who has walked with you across lifetimes. Thoth's prophecy hints at such guides returning when humanity needs them, most times of upheaval, division, and loss. They come not to dominate or control, but to steady, to remind, and to guide us back to what matters. It is no accident that these beings appear in moments of personal transition, the loss of a loved one, the move to an unfamiliar place, a season of illness or spiritual searching. Their arrival often feels like a quiet rescue, a lifeline you didn't know you needed until they were there. And their departure, whether through death or disappearance, leaves a gap that feels bigger than life itself. Yet even in absence, their role continues. Many report feeling a lingering presence, footsteps in the hall, the warmth of a body at the edge of the bed, the sudden comfort in a moment of despair. Some believe this is the spirit of the guide, still watching from the threshold, waiting for the moment they will walk beside you again in another form. Across cultures, across centuries, The image is the same, a dog at the gate, standing between the known and the unknown. Whether it is the entrance to an ancient temple, the doorway of your home, or the invisible passage between worlds, they hold that space with a devotion so complete it humbles us. In honoring them, we honor the mystery they serve, a mystery that says we are never truly alone in our journey. Somewhere, a guide has chosen you, and in that choice, your paths are bound together until the work is done. And when they look into your eyes, perhaps they are seeing not just who you are now, but every version of you they have ever guarded. In the writings attributed to Thoth, there is a passage few have read in full, one that speaks of a time when the breath of the earth shall quicken, yet the hearts of men will grow heavy. It is the kind of cryptic phrase scholars debate endlessly until you set it against the world we live in now. Pandemics that shut down entire nations, climate patterns twisting into unfamiliar shapes, cities swelling and then emptying, their streets gone eerily still, political fractures deepening like cracks in ancient stone. If Thoth's prophecy was a map, we are standing on one of its marked crossroads. It is in these times, the prophecy says, that the guardians will walk among you, unseen in their full form, yet felt in the marrow of your being. To many, that sounds like poetry. To those who live with dogs, it sounds like something they've already witnessed. Over the last few years, adoption shelters have reported unprecedented surges in people taking dogs home. In the first months of the pandemic, cages that had sat full for years were suddenly empty. People spoke of wanting companionship during lockdowns, but for others, the choice felt deeper, like an instinct they couldn't explain. A pull toward bringing a guardian into their lives, even if they didn't use that word for it. And when the world was at its most uncertain, these dogs didn't just fill space, they steadied it. They seemed to sense when fear was thick in the air, curling up beside someone who'd just read bad news, or nudging a hand until it unclenched. In neighborhoods where tempers were frayed and grief was raw, people began to notice how gatherings with dogs felt lighter. A shared moment at the park, a wagging tail between strangers who might otherwise have passed each other in silence. Some spiritual teachers point to this as evidence of the balancing force described in Hermetic tradition. Dogs, they say, absorb more than our loneliness. They drink in the disharmony of a space and return something calmer. Like living resonators, they harmonize the vibrations around them, helping communities hold together through upheaval. There are stories that sound almost impossible until you hear enough of them to notice a pattern. A dog who refused to let his owner leave the house minutes before an earthquake hit. A rescue mutt who barked incessantly until a neighbor discovered a gas leak. A gentle retriever who began sleeping in the hallway outside a teenager's room, later revealing she'd been hiding self-harm scars. These are not just acts of loyalty, they are acts of intervention, timed with uncanny precision. Thoth's vision of the guardians wasn't limited to the personal. He spoke of them as keepers of the balance when the scales tip too far. In times of war, famine, or great social fracture, the presence of such beings was meant to remind humanity of its shared spirit. In that light, the sudden global increase in dogs living in human homes looks less like coincidence and more like a coordinated response from something greater than us. But the prophecy also carried a warning. The guardians could steady us, yes, but they could not make our choices for us. They may lead you to the water, it says, but they cannot drink for you. In other words, their presence is an opportunity, not a guarantee. We still decide whether we follow their example, living with loyalty, compassion, and awareness, or continue down the path of division. Perhaps that is why, in the midst of planetary chaos, the quiet work of these animals feels so important. They are not shouting in the streets or sitting in halls of power. They are in our kitchens and gardens, on our sidewalks and porches, leaning against our legs when we think the world is too much to bear. They remind us, in every small act of steadiness, that the center still holds if we choose to hold it. And maybe that is the awakening Thoth saw. Not a single, blinding moment of revelation, but millions of tiny ones, each sparked by a wet nose against a palm, a pair of eyes that say without words, "I'm here, we're in this together, let's walk on." In the temples of ancient Egypt, wisdom was not simply written down, it was lived, breathed, and guarded like a flame. Among the most closely held teachings of Thoth was the belief that divine knowledge could take unexpected forms, sometimes wearing the face of a god, sometimes the pages of a sacred text, and sometimes the eyes of an animal. To the initiates of the Hermetic tradition, nothing in nature was accidental. Every creature was a vessel for a frequency, a purpose, a lesson waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. For centuries, these teachings were the province of scribes, priests, and seekers who could travel to the edges of the known world. The Book of Thoth itself, wrapped in legend, was said to grant the reader the ability to understand the language of all living beings. Most believed such magic was lost, or perhaps never real to begin with. But if you've ever looked at your dog and felt they understood something you hadn't said out loud, you may already be touching a piece of that same thread. Hermetic philosophy rests on the idea of correspondence. As above, so below. As within, so without. The ancients applied this to the stars and the seasons, the body and the soul, the seen and unseen. What they knew, and what modern science is beginning to rediscover, is that connection flows through all living things. Dogs, with their uncanny attunement to human moods, are living demonstrations of that law. They mirror our inner state. They harmonize with our emotions. In doing so, they teach us about the nature of resonance, the same principle alchemists used to transform base metals into gold. The transformation here isn't literal gold, but something more precious. The shift from fear to trust, from isolation to belonging. Ancient adepts might have called this transmutation of the heart. And in countless modern homes, this alchemy is quietly at work. A child learns patience because the family dog will only respond to calm energy. An anxious parent finds their breathing slow when a warm head rests on their lap. A grieving widower begins to laugh again because a dog insists on a daily walk, pulling him back into the rhythm of the world. It's easy to dismiss these as small comforts, but Hermeticists would have seen them as sacred exchanges. In their worldview, love and presence were not sentimental extras. They were forces capable of reshaping reality. A dog's gaze, steady and unjudging, becomes an alchemical vessel, turning the heavy lead of human sorrow into the lighter gold of hope. Modern science, for its part, is beginning to corroborate what mystics have always claimed. Studies in animal-assisted therapy show measurable drops in blood pressure and stress hormones after interaction with dogs. Neuroscience reveals that mutual gazing between a human and a dog can trigger the release of oxytocin, the same hormone that deepens bonds between mothers and infants. To a Hermetic thinker, these findings are not surprises, but translations, the language of spirit rendered in the data of the lab. And there is something profoundly Egyptian in the way these guardians move through our lives. In the old myths, Anubis guided souls through the underworld, not with fear, but with steadfast companionship. Today, our dogs guide us through the underworlds we carry inside grief, anxiety, uncertainty, leading us back toward the light. The setting may have changed from stone temple to suburban living room, but the essence of the work remains the same. Perhaps that is the real Hermetic return, not the recovery of a single lost book, but the reappearance of an ancient principle, embodied in fur and heartbeat, padding quietly across the threshold into our homes. In a time when the world feels fractured, these living messengers remind us of an unbroken truth. Wisdom is never truly lost. It adapts, it disguises itself, and it arrives when we need it most, sometimes with nothing more dramatic than a wag of the tail and a silent promise in its eyes. There are moments in history when the world seems to hold its breath, times when events, both great and small, gather into a quiet but unmistakable turning point. The Hermeticists called these thresholds the hours of choice, moments when you must decide which path you'll walk. Not tomorrow, not someday, but now. You may not realize it, but you are standing in such an hour. All around us, chaos, swirls, political unrest, climate extremes, personal uncertainty. And yet, amid that turbulence, something gentle and constant has been walking at your side. Perhaps they've been there for years. Perhaps they just entered your life by chance, or so you thought. They are your dog, your companion, your silent witness, and they are more than you've ever suspected. The ancients would tell you that a spiritual guardian often arrives disguised as the ordinary. Their purpose is not to save you in the dramatic sense, but to guide you back to what you already are, whole, complete, connected. In this, dogs are masters. They do not come to fix you, because you were never broken. They come to remind you of the truths you've buried under years of noise. That you are worthy of love without condition. That you have the strength to keep going. That joy is still possible, even in the shadow of grief. Choosing to see your dog in this way is not a flight of fancy. It is an act of courage. It means opening your eyes to the subtle ways they speak. The way they wait at the door before you've even grabbed your keys. How they press closer when your thoughts turn dark. How they meet your gaze, as if searching for the part of you that has forgotten how to shine. In Hermetic teachings, this is the mirror of the soul, a reflection offered not to judge, but to awaken. And so the choice before you is simple, but not easy. You can go on treating them as a background presence in your life, a comfort when it's convenient. Or you can step into the kind of relationship the ancients would have recognized as sacred, a conscious, mutual journey. This doesn't require grand rituals or secret words. It asks for presence, for listening, for honoring the small moments as the gateways they truly are. Every day, your guardian is showing you the path, toward patience when they stop to sniff the wind, toward playfulness when they nudge a ball your way, toward stillness when they curl beside you in the quiet. These are not distractions from your real life. They are your real life, the teachings, the invitations, the reminders that existence is richer and more mysterious than you've been taught to believe. The hour of choice is here, and while the world debates, delays, and doubts, your spiritual guardian waits without judgment. They will walk with you no matter which path you choose. But know this, should you choose to see them as they truly are, you will never walk the same road again. The air will seem lighter, the shadows less threatening, and the thread that connects you to the unseen will feel, for the first time, unbreakable. So look into their eyes tonight. Feel the steadiness of their heartbeat under your hand. And remember, you are not just loved, you are accompanied, you are guided. And somewhere in the ancient weave of fate, you and your dog agreed to meet here in this exact moment, so you could both remember who you really are. Because the choice isn't just about the path you'll take. It's about the person and the soul you'll become by taking it. You did not arrive here by accident. Somewhere between the pages of ancient prophecy and the quiet moments you share with your dog, threads have been weaving together, threads that lead you to this exact moment. Thoth's vision was never about a distant future. It was about now, and if you're hearing these words, you are already part of it. The signs are everywhere, in the way your companion senses shifts in your heart before you speak, in the comfort they offer when the world feels heavy, in the unspoken understanding that passes between you like a current. These are not coincidences. They are the markers of an awakening already in motion. The choice before you is not about believing or not believing. It's about stepping forward with awareness, about letting this bond, this ancient, living bridge, guide you back to what you've always known, but perhaps forgotten. So take this as your invitation. Pay attention, lean into the connection, let it change you. The guardians are here, and their work has already begun. The only question is, will you walk with them into what comes next?